Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Bridgitte Barclay. Dr. Barclay has a new book, Creatures in the Classroom. I've had some creatures in the classroom, but
So
that's probably not what you're writing about. Your background is in, I know, eco-media and science fiction and environmental humanities. Tell me about the creatures in the classroom. Are these creatures that are crawling around on the floor in the science lab, or what? Yeah.
It's a way of us. There's a group of us at environmental conferences at ASLE, Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, that have a stream of eco-media. And so we've, over the last few years, five to 10 years, there's been this uptrend in talking about creature features. And so it's really, we started thinking about how we use them in the classroom and enjoyed going out to bars after the panels and talking about what we did in the classroom with them. So it's a way of us kind of, how do we deal with the dire environmental things that are going on in the world and kind of bring them into a classroom. And creature features are this really lovely way that students kind of react to, with confusion sometimes, but also with some laughter.
Well, I think that's probably true to some extent for what they do for the public, right?
Right.
I mean, people maybe aren't concerned about these things, go to a movie for some other reason and get exposed to information that they wouldn't have had, right?
Yeah, take some pill with the sugar, yeah.
Having, moved in this direction then, you kind of have a catalog of what all of these creature features are. I'd be interested in going through that and talking about the differences from the different periods here. So if we started out with the 1920s, I think, right?
Yeah.
What were the early examples of this?
Well, if we're thinking about the early stuff in the 20s and 30s, right? King Kong, we mentioned, and Kong has been revived recently with Godzilla and Kong, the movie that was heavily environmental, right? Right. Very like saccharine environmentalism.
I don't like to mix my monsters.
Right. You don't like them fighting each other?
No. I didn't like Predator versus Aliens or any of those things,
But a lot of that stuff, a lot of this horror and, because creature features are horror and science fiction, right? They kind of are that fuzzy boundary where it's a little bit of both.
Right.
And obviously have to have a creature in them. So some of the zombie films I wouldn't consider creature features, although some I would. It kind of depends, like The Last of Us, the earlier stuff we talk about, that's fungi doing it. So I would consider that a creature, but the early stuff I wouldn't consider a creature feature if it was zombies. But if we're doing like King Kong and then moving into the 30s and 40s, there's some, but the 50s is where it really...
Well, so in these early movies though, it seems like it was science fiction in the sense that they were taking what we learned from natural history and exaggerating that and showing us what life would have been like if we lived in the era, in the time when there was dinosaurs or
I think that's really important.
Or with a large mountain-sized ape, right?
Right. Absolutely. So creatures are usually either really large or there's a lot of them, right? In a creature feature.
Right, they have to overwhelm you one way or another.
One way or the other, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think is really cool about the 20s, 30s, 40s, there's a lot of this lost world sort of stuff happening, right? Because the expedition, so the U.S. dinosaur rush was in the late 19th century, right? So all of these museums were building their collections and literally fighting each other to get to bones and start collecting them.
Right.
The American Museum of Natural History and the Field Museum were obviously two of the big pushes for those. And think about in the teens and 20s and 30s, it really wasn't up until the 40s and 50s that everyday folks like us could go see dinosaurs put together and sort of understand extinction in this new way. So I think that's a really big, important part of this.
And so it reintroduced them into our lives in a way, right? And made it possible for these movies to come and visualize these things for
and
us,
those fights between extinction and evolution, right? Those are two sides of the same coin, is the way Elizabeth Kolbert writes about it. So I think that, because that was such a big political moment too, that the idea of extinction, like we could go extinct, what was the creation of the universe? Well,
that's a bigger theme as time goes on.
Right. Absolutely.
Necessarily so. And then we get to the 50s and the 60s, and it always seemed to me that the movies in the 50s were kind of based on a fear of what was going on with the nuclear testing that we were doing. I think they attribute a lot of the monsters that were created in those movies to exposure to radiation and things like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, Gamera and Godzilla, right? But they both wake up when there's explosions happening, and I think if I can see a paper mache, then I feel like or a suitmation, and I'm in love with the creature. But it's the same thing. So it's atomic stuff that awakens them. So I think it's this fear of, but also fascination with.
Yeah, so fear of the
atomic
unknown
warfare.
and fear of the experimentation with science.
Yeah,
during
and a
that
mistrust
period.
in the 50s, right? The pushback, sort of the scene was a pushback against militarized, corporatized science, because we were after the Second World War. We saw that, speaking of extinction, we could go extinct, right?
And this is the era of 1954. One of your favorites, I know, Creature from the Black Lagoon, right?
Yes, my absolute favorite.
Yeah. What do you like about that?
I love that sort of really important underwater scene. So there's the one scene where it's being mirrored, and I think it's just such a good read. There's so many parts of it that read really well with environmental, but even before that, I just loved the allure of it. It's kind of a quieter film by today's standards, for sure, right?
Yeah, they are.
But it's a slow-moving film, and there's that scene where Kay is swimming on top of the water, and the creature is mirroring her under, right?
Yeah.
And we have all of these shots that were, Jaws used a lot of the shots, so they were inspired by, Creature had all of these really amazing camera angles, right? The creature behind the bushes and sort of coming out. So we get his, the creature's, Gillman, we get his point of view for a lot of things too. So we're looking at the humans rather
so
than
that was
the humans
innovative
looking
in a lot
at.
of ways then, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had two different actors for the Gillman. One was the land Gillman, and the one was, I think it was
really?
Rickard Browning, I think, was underwater, who just passed, I think, just last couple of years.
It wasn't like Bridges, huh? Okay.
Yeah. But it's fascinating is that there were two of them.
Yeah, I remember being terrified when he was coming out of the water.
Yeah.
I think it was like at dusk or something.
Yeah, he walks a very, very Frankenstein creature kind
Yeah,
of
when
walk.
you think about it, he's never going to catch you, right?
Yeah.
What do you have to worry about? That guy's not going to run too fast.
Just don't get in the water again.
Just knock him down, you know. He'll flop around on the ground for a while.
Yeah, and they have the scientists when they're kind of traveling through there, they have such, even though it's such a beautiful, well made in creature feature genre, because they're usually not well made, but that one they're just blatantly like throwing chemicals into the water to kill the fish and to kill Gilman, and they're just like, throw some more in. And so it's just funny watching, like, this is an Amazon lagoon, but sure, throw some chemicals in.
The result of our negligence.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So a lot of new themes come up in the 50s and 60s, and I know the one that always fascinated me was the birds, because it was an example of the pathetic fallacy. They actually imply in the dialogue in there that we've done something to the environment that's causing this reaction. And there really were no monsters in the movie. They just took normal birds.
Which can be kind of scary,
and made
right?
them
They're little
scary,
dinosaurs, right? Sort of.
They are, yeah. Well, we know that from watching Jurassic Park, right? Yeah.
No, I think in that 60s is that cool transition period, right? So we're moving into, so I think Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in '62, right? So we're moving from the 50s to more blatant stuff
That's
in
an
the 60s.
important piece of this, isn't it?
That opens up with the fact that it's a silent spring because the birds aren't singing. So I think that connection is really interesting there. And then by the 70s, we have all of these. The EPA is established. We have all of these environmental protection moments, even for animals on film that weren't there for the birds, for instance, and the gender stuff with Hitchcock and Hedren. And there's lots of fascinating gender stuff happening in the 60s as we're transitioning to. And I think those are tied. Women's reproductive rights and environmental
really? Going all the way back to the birds, huh?
Yeah, I think so. You've got, overpopulation and reproductive rights go hand in hand. You can't take them apart. And a lot of the science fiction, women writing science fiction in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were writing about reproduction. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So really, if we look at this in terms of the public sphere here, we can see it absorbing these ideas and processing them, and it's sort of on the fringes of what we would consider public debate, because these things weren't being talked about in the Nixon-Kennedy debate, for instance, right?
Yeah, because they were coming from those B films, right? So I think that's one of the ways that, as much as I love Jaws and Jurassic Park and those others, those B films are really bad ones. Because you can, because it's pushback, they're sort of building on exploitation films of the 60s and 70s, right, which were just meant to be titillating, really, right? Titillating, entertaining. Roger Corman was known for just making a film in just a few days without permits or anything else, without budgets. He would just show up on a street and start filming things. And so they always got things done really fast. I think Wasp Woman was done in less than a week, I want to say, but I'm not positive. But all of that stuff, I think, plays into the fact that it's pushing back. It's not the master narrative of a culture, right? Like the big studios would have to do. It's not going through executives to get done. It's just, what does Roger Corman want to do today, right?
Which is hard to ascribe any plan to. But, yeah.
Right. But then in the 70s too, when we move into the 70s, we have much more explicit pieces. A wasp woman animal. She's turning into a wasp, and then she gets very powerful, she's a woman who's a boss before, so obviously unnatural, right? And so then she has to become a wasp. But then frogs in the 70s with
of course,
Sam
we got frogs
Elliott.
in the Old Testament too, right?
Oh yeah, very good. But Sam Elliott is in full denim, just canoeing, and those are just lots of frogs explicitly fighting chemical warfare. And that's about the same time as Jaws.
I'll have to see that one.
It's a really good one, yeah. I mean, by really good, I mean really bad.
By really bad,
but
yeah.
Sam Elliott is in all denim.
Yeah. Well, so, but as we get into the later years here, the last 25, 30 years, some of these movies are actually very consciously representing the effects of things like climate change, right?
Yeah. I think so the Kong Godzilla movie I talked about, it was actually, my friends and I were in environmental humanities were talking about it, that I found it as one of the least enjoyable movies. As much as I love seeing animals fight, I do like to have two of them together. It is not those creatures fighting. It was just such a saccharine sort of overdoing of the environmental thing that it just seemed like reuse, recycle, right? Like it was a quick fix to, well, if humans could just think about the environment. Whereas I think something like de-extinction, that there's this trend for de-extinction.
Oh, there's
in
an
films.
interesting concept. We should introduce this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So extinction. So we know we're in the 6th extinction, right? So humans have caused the greatest extinction since.
Yeah. So there have been 6
dinosaurs.
mass extinctions in the history of the world.
And this one is the
and we're
Anthropocene.
in one right now,
the humans have caused this
which
one,
is being
right?
driven by
ocean acidification, by deforestation, lots of different things. Yeah.
Okay.
There's this resurgence right now of de-extinction, right? So it's almost as though we're unsure about the future. We know that all of these extinctions have happened in the past, and so now we're imagining, what is it like if these creatures came back to life, right? If we had some creatures that could survive in the ice or other things, right? So
and that's sort of the plot of Jurassic Park, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're finding these the amber with mosquitoes in it and extracting dino DNA, as they call it, right?
Yeah.
And creating the dinosaurs. But that's actually something that people are trying to do right now, isn't it?
And the mammoths, they're doing woolly mammoths in Siberia right now, right? So CRISPR technology that came out, I don't know, like 8 or 10 years ago. I'm not a scientist, but 8 or 10 years ago made that kind of work much more feasible and cheap and accessible.
So these movies make us aware of these issues and give us a broader understanding of sort of the ecological environment and things. But now they're more specifically articulating these environmental issues. Are there films now, or do you expect that there will be films that will be intended to motivate people to go out and do something?
I do, and I think, so there's two sides of this. I think some of them are putting out an intentional message, right? And I think some of the films are just cultural artifacts from our current fears, right? Horror is notoriously based on what are the fears right now. Yeah. And so, anything Gothic is showing what is going on in a certain era, and science fiction is always the what if. What if we had the technology to do X, Y, Z? So you put those together, and you've got those fuzzy boundaries of what are we scared of, and what can we do technologically? Yeah. So some of the films are making those larger arguments. So even Handmaid's Tale, it's not a creature feature, but there's an environmental angle in the show, right? They're talking about the depletion that was just kind of background in the book. But Fortitude is a British show that's really good, and it's got one that's an environmental.
And it's interesting to think about all this and think about how people are reacting to the pandemic that we just went through with COVID, and the theories about this coming out of a lab in Wuhan and stuff. You see any connections between any of that discussion and what's been happening in the
It's
history
interesting.
of these films?
I haven't seen anything yet. I mean, and because it's still, they keep working through all these theories, and it still hasn't been worked out. Like the Wuhan theory was one of the early ones, right? And
it's quite a coincidence that there's this lab right where
it
this
is
begins,
quite,
right? And I've seen enough movies that I can't just set that aside.
Right. But they're still working on where the originating issue was. But I think that trope kind of was in creature features before, maybe it was in real life, right? We've been seeing that trope for a long time. In Night of the Lepus, which is just a bunch of really big rabbits, and in The Monster That Challenged the World, which is set in the Salton Sea, which is a really interesting point right now too, because the Salton Sea is sort of predated some of the major issues in the Salton Sea, which is fascinating. But both of those have little girls wandering into labs and releasing animals. So right, it's sort of like this things in a lab get out, and that's what causes the issue. So it's been in creature features for a while. It's a really interesting trope, and so then to translate it to real life, like it could happen.
Well,
I
and
guess,
it's not a a far-fetched impossibility by any means, is it?
No, not at all. Yeah.
So I'm aware of some of the things that you've been looking at and that you use in your classes. One is The Last of Us. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm teaching Entangled Life right now, Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, which is about fungi. And we talk about, one of the chapters talks about zombie fungi, and we've known this for ages, that there are fungi that take over the ants' brains or wasps' brains, like, and lead them to their deaths so that it can spread, right? And
the Pied Piper fungi. Or
right.
Something.
Oh yeah. And there's also horizontal gene transfers between some fungi. So there's really stuff that are, when we think about the dichotomies of the human, we're just like, they're doing so many other, there probably are overlords,
plus,
the fungi.
Plus there's a network of fungi that envelops
under
the globe, right?
The trees, I mean, in our gut, on our skin right
now. And they
now,
react to one another and stuff.
Right.
I've been reading
the new
about
research on like the gut biome is that it probably a huge part of our personality is based on the bacteria and fungi and all the other stuff that's in our gut.
Okay, Steven Spielberg, if you're listening,
this is a good one, right?
We've got your next plot
film.
here.
I want to cut though.
So The Last of Us, that's a HBO.
Yeah, HBO,
series.
And it's the series with humans have been taken over, and that when you watch some of the special effects are very much like what happens. You can look up zombie fungi and ants and see what happens to the ants, but they go up and then it just starts growing out. So the visual effect is actually right on, just human scale.
It's real.
Yeah, it's real. Not for humans yet, but it's real.
So they're going to take over eventually.
I think that, if there's an alien on Earth, it's probably the fungi.
It's the fungi. Yeah, or maybe we're the aliens, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, and the fungi live here.
Yeah.
One of the things that is kind of a theme here that comes up in different ways is there's this plot that's behind, say like King Kong, that there's a part of the world that we didn't know about, and when it's behind I think the island he's on is supposed to be hidden by clouds, and when we get there we find out that there are all these large animals from prehistory that are still there. So that theory is that there's things that survive that we just don't know about.
Yeah.
And then there's the theory about the DNA can be extracted from the mosquitoes in Jurassic Park. And there was also a period, 20th century, when they discovered all of the remains in the tar pits, right? Libera tar pits. And
so
now,
just understanding history in a different way, right?
Yeah. And now, and I remember that they made a movie about that specifically, and they found a caveman, and the caveman was revived, and I was always worried that he was going to come around and grab me at night while I was sleeping.
I'd be worried about a caveman too.
He looked a lot like Alley-Oop, if you remember Alley-Oop.
I don't.
But so now, I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, the ice caps are melting, and there are parts of the globe that were sealed under ice for centuries, for millennia perhaps, right?
Yeah.
And things are being exposed, and we don't know what that's going to turn up, right?
Yeah. As Scientific American has published several stories on new viruses being exposed. So I think there's lots of interesting things. I talk about a script again for Spielberg. Lots of interesting things being exposed right now.
Yeah.
And I want to point out in the 20s too that we're still in the height of the museum expeditions, and so this idea of So it was 1893 at the Chicago Columbian Exposition that Turner declared the West closed, right? It had been inhabited by colonizing European settlers, right? And so it was considered closed at that point. And so then Roosevelt and Hornaday for American Museum of Natural History and Carl Akeley at Field Museum all started going overseas to do their exploration. So that tied in really interestingly right around the time where people are also traveling to different parts because of the 2 world wars. So this we're done here with new stuff, let's go elsewhere.
Let's go check it out.
I mean, Roosevelt notoriously shot like thousands more animals than the Smithsonian needed for one of his expeditions, right?
We're
just going
talking
other
about Teddy,
places.
everybody, not Franklin.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Teddy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he actually he founded the museum, I think, right, in New York.
He was, yes, yeah. So
think
he was
there's
a
a
big
statue
part
of
of
him
that.
out there or
Yeah,
something,
he was
right?
a big
Yeah.
part of that, and then he
Yeah.
did some of the expeditions for that. And Carl Akeley was in the
Yeah, I
Field
think I
Museum
remember
here.
seeing a presentation there. They had his, I think it might have been behind glass, but it was his
Yeah.
trunks and all of the things that he carried with him.
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
It looked
he
like a
traveled big.
campsite, maybe. Yeah.
He traveled really
Yeah,
big.
he had a lot
I
of
think it
money.
may have been taken down too. I think the statue may have been taken down recently, but I can't
Oh.
quite remember
Yeah.
because they decided that maybe he was a little problematic with some of the exploration.
Yeah, yeah. All the
have to
statues are going to
agree.
come down eventually,
Yeah.
I'm sure. Right. But yeah, Roosevelt was certainly very opinionated about a lot of things.
He was.
But part of this is, what was interesting about this is that he was going to Africa, like you were saying, right? And
Lots of different nations in Africa,
yeah,
and Belgium,
and throughout
Congo.
history, Africa's always had this aura about it, about mystery and connecting to the past and things
To
like
European
that.
folks, yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah. That hasn't figured that much in these movies, though.
There's a lot of them, actually.
Yeah.
There's one called White Pongo. I mean, King Kong has really racialized undertones as well, right? So
Oh, is that right?
There's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah,
racialized
sure.
stuff that's happening in the 20s and 30s, and eugenics was a major conversation in the 20s and 30s. So there's
Yeah.
some highly problematic creature
Yeah.
features from that time period. And we've got this romanticization of places where other people have lived for a very long time, right? So the
Yeah.
westward expansion in the US, indigenous folks had lived there for ages. So when we're talking about something being settled,
Right.
So there's all this, Roosevelt took some of the land, made all these national parks, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
But that land was taken from indigenous folks, then
Right.
to be given back for white folks to be able to have public lands, right?
Right,
And so
right.
it's the narrative of animals, I think, is really fascinating in animals and land, and American identity is really, really important to the way we imagine things.
Yeah, and a lot of animals have become extinct since that period. So
Oh, yeah.
we only know about them now because of some of that exploration,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of that exploration that then made the habitat dioramas, right, at the Field Museum.
Right,
And so
right.
it's the same, to me, those relates to creature features in a same sort of way, right? We're telling a story about creatures, but we're really telling a story about ourselves, right? So it's the creatures are there, but it's just a way to tell a story about ourselves.
Yeah, and while this is going on, the Amazon is drying up because of deforestation.
Right.
And things like that.
Yeah.
So where does this go? What do you think? Are we going to get
This being
bored by
creature
these
features,
movies
or-
at some point? Are we going to accept that we're destroying
know.
ourselves and not be interested in it
Some people hate them
anymore?
already, so I don't know if anybody,
Yeah.
I'm not going to get bored with them. I do think that, I mean, they're a narrative, they're a cultural artifact, so they're always, whatever our fear is, whatever
Yeah.
our concerns are, whatever our what if is, I think
Yeah.
that will keep happening, right? They might be holograms instead of films, but
Right.
as the technology changes, but I think absolutely they'll keep going. I mean, they're happening in games, they're happening, there's no way that humans can't tell stories about ourselves. We just keep doing it until we die off. So I guess there could be an end.
Well, it is
when
interesting.
the planet is done.
It's interesting to see where our imagination takes us. So,
Yeah.
certainly in the 50s, it was taking us in one direction, and it was taking us in different directions in
Yeah.
the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah.
So, kind of as a wrap up, though,
Yeah.
let's talk about what we mean by eco-media.
Film, documentaries, that could be creature features, games. So we're thinking about usually non-written material, although even museum exhibits, there's some written material there, but really it's a different type of materiality. Anything
Yeah.
that tells the story of environmental issues, even if it doesn't mean to. So I think you can read a lot of things as eco-media, but it's
Yeah.
usually non-novels.
So it's
right?
an interesting category, and
Yeah.
it does or doesn't incorporate the creature features.
Yes, creature features would fall under
So
eco-media.
from that all the way to maybe
Museum exhibits,
yeah,
habitat
and
dioramas, documentaries.
and they're all part of our consciousness of
Yeah.
what the environment looks like
Yeah.
and what it holds for us, right?
And how we tell the stories. Yeah,
Yeah, very good.
Absolutely.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Bridgitte Barclay for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.